This is Time Signatures with Jim Ervin, a podcast and radio program presented by the Capital Area Blues Society in Lansing, Michigan.
Driving up and down these Michigan roads, yeah.
And now, here he is, your host, Jim Ervin.
Baby, I'm home.
Well, thank you so much, Parker, and welcome to Time Signatures. I'm your host, Jim Ervin, and before I open the program today, I would like to take a moment to recognize the passing of legendary bluesman John Mayall, who passed away last evening at the age of 90. So many of the artists in the blues community have shared stories about John, and I just wanted to pay homage to the memory of this man. My only regret is that I never got to have him on this program and to preserve some stories, and for that I'm sorry. Sorry that I didn't start the project sooner. God rest you, John Mayall. And so as we move forward, my guest today is an absolute living encyclopedia of blues knowledge. After all, he helped write the book, truly. He is a Saginaw, Michigan native and has been a rubboard player and percussionist since 1967, but there's a lot more. He's traveled the world with legendary bluesman Lazy Lester as his manager and booking agent for more than 30 years. And if that isn't enough, he also began researching the history of the blues in Detroit in 1970. He not only worked with Lazy Lester, he's also booked gigs and interviewed many of the greats of old, including Lightnin Slim, Washboard Willie, Chicago Pete, and Larry McRae, just to name a few. Now, I could go on, but it's time to turn the microphone over to our guest and musician, blues historian, and author, Fred Reif. Fred, how are you? And welcome to Time Signatures.
Hi, I'm glad to be here. Speaking of John Mayall,
Yes, sir.
back in the, I'd say late 60s, I used to go to a lot of Michigan rock festivals, mostly around Detroit area. And John Mayall used to play at quite a few of them. So I got to see him many times. And I think the last time we saw him, I did a gig with Lazy Lester in Toledo. And my band at the time was from Providence, Rhode Island. So we got a hotel room in downtown Toledo. And John Mayall was also staying there.
Oh, wow.
Well, I met John Mayall while he was in line getting a room, and he had no roadies. He helped bring in the equipment. I mean, actually carrying the amps and stuff and speakers, and I was really impressed.
Yeah,
I mean, to me, he was always a legend.
Yes, sir. I had heard that a lot of the blues musicians used to pump their own gear for a lot of years, and then that kind of went by the wayside with some of the bigger gigs. But yeah, it's when you've got somebody that's old school like that, it shouldn't be a surprise, should it?
Not really. Um, Actually, when I toured with Lazy Lester for all those years, we always carried our equipment, except in Europe, where they wouldn't let you. They'd
Wow.
say, I forget what they were called, but our tour manager, he would always say, no, put that down. I said, well, my washboard isn't that heavy. He goes, put it down. They will carry it in for you. And I went, okay, no problem.
Wow.
So
Well, Fred, we've got a lot of ground to cover here, and I've got to be honest. There's so much to digest and discuss. I think what I'm going to do is just kind of begin with talking about your passion for music. What are your earliest memories of music?
Elvis Presley. I had a an older cousin who turned me on to Elvis when I was still, let's say, he was about 12 or 13. So he was 3 years older than I am. And he turned me on to Elvis. And I I just loved Elvis, and I got to see him on the Ed Sullivan Show, and so from the Elvis, it just went to Little Richard, Fats Domino, Ricky Nelson, et cetera, et cetera. Beach Boys. I think
Sure.
that the Beach Boys live album was the first actual album I bought. Well, I belonged at the time you could join the Columbia Record
Yeah,
Club
Columbia House. Yeah.
and get 10 free records. And
Yep.
that's how
Yep.
I got my first Bob Dylan album.
Wow.
And so this was, I was probably still in high school.
Sure.
And in 1967, I was going to Saginaw Business Institute, which was a local college here. And previously, I went to Delta College, but I had to get my grades up because of the draft. And so I went to Saginaw Business Institute, and I met a guy there by the name of Mike Gilmore. And he asked me, he said, out of the blue one day, he said, "You want to be in a jug band?" And I said, "Yeah, that sounds cool. What's a jug band?" I was already a drummer, but
Sure.
I had no idea what a jug band was. So I went to rehearsal, and they had for the percussion, they had all kinds of bells and stuff hanging up. And but in the corner, I saw a washboard. So I went and I goes, "Oh, there's a washboard over there." And they said, "Play it." And I said, "What?" So, anyways, I picked it up, and John Gilmore, who was also in the band, he was kind of the leader of the band. He gave me some guitar picks, and so I just started playing with guitar picks, kind of it was quiet, but uh and that turned my whole career because up until that point, I went to college to be in the men's clothing business. I,
Oh,
I had a
wow.
job. I was assistant manager of a local Webster store. And
Okay.
so the manager said, "Well, if you get your education, you could move up in the company." So that's what I wanted to do. But as soon as I picked up that washboard, that was it. I just everything changed in my life.
Well,
And I was still
John,
going to college,
yeah, go
but
ahead.
through that, I started to, John Gilmore gave me a bunch of albums to listen to, which were jug band, washboard albums, Jim Queskin, jug band, stuff like that, plus old country blues. So I started to listen to that. And previously to that, of course, I have to admit, I got turned on to the Chicago blues by the British invasion,
Okay.
by the
Makes
Rolling
sense.
Stones, the Animals,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
stuff like that. Uh, so I got their first couple albums, and I'm going, well, who was McKinley Morganfield? Who wrote, they always had who wrote the songs. Who's McKinley Morganfield? Who's Ellis Mc what's Bo Diddley's name? Ellis McDaniel. And so I started looking them up and realized, hey, I got to buy their records. So it wasn't until after the country blues that I started to really buy a lot of Chicago blues. And I also had a subscription about 1969, 68, 69 of a magazine in England called Blues Unlimited.
Oh, wow.
And at the time, they were probably the only blues magazine in the world. This was even before Living Blues. So there was an article in there that said Lightnin Slim, Louisiana Swamp King or whatever they called him, the godfather of the blues from Louisiana, lived in Pontiac, Michigan, and someone should go try to find him. Well, I did just that. And
Wow.
I can't remember exactly how I found his address or where he was living, but I did. And a friend of mine and I went down there and we knocked on the door, and it was um, Willie Murray who answered the door. And his wife was Tilly Murray, who was Slim Harpo's sister.
Okay.
And I said, does Lightnin Slim live here? And they said, yep, yep. He's expecting you, and he's over at Miss Sarah's house watching the Tigers. Uh, and I said, okay. And he gave me the directions how to get there. It was only a block or two away. So I went there and introduced myself, and we just became instant friends. And I asked him if he wanted to get back into playing again, and he goes, well, nah, I don't know. I don't know. And he just kept hemming and hawing. And but previously in 69, Slim Harpo had picked him up in Pontiac to go play at Steve Paul's scene in New York City,
Oh, wow.
which I didn't know at the time. And so it wasn't, he was not completely out of it, out of music, but he had a job in a factory, actually a foundry, and he showed me his hands. He goes, look at my hands. And they were turning white. And I went, whoa. He goes, well, that's because of all the fire that's in the foundry and blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, look, I'm going to get, we're going to, we're going to get you out of here. So I finally talked him into it later that year. Well, later that year in 1970 was the Ann Arbor, the first, no, the second Ann Arbor Blues Festival.
Okay.
So I went to it, and I somehow I got backstage passes. I can't remember exactly how I got it, but um, they knew I was working with, I just started working with Lightnin, a couple of the people that were involved in the festival. So they said, hey, if you go get them, we'll make time and we'll put them on the festival.
Wow.
So I drove from Ann Arbor back over to Pontiac to get him. And at that point, he still didn't want to. So I drove back and said, well, I made up some excuse for him. And so they said, okay, all right. So then about a month later, I get well, not an email, but actual letter from the Chicago Folk Festival people. And they wanted me, because I wrote an article for Blues Unlimited by that
Okay.
time and on
Sure.
Lightnin. And so they wanted me to put together a reunion of Lightnin Slim and Lazy Lester.
Wow.
And I
Okay.
said, fantastic. Okay. Although I don't know where Lester is. So I called up Lightnin and I said, told him the story. And he said, well, I can get a hold of him. I got a number for him. So I called that number and talked to Lester on the phone. And he said, yeah, sure. Yeah, anything for my old friend Lightnin. So I sent him some money for a bus ticket up here,
Okay.
and he never showed up.
Oh no.
He spent the money. So I told the people from Chicago at the folk festival what happened. And so they said, we still want to do it. We'll send them a bus ticket. I said, okay. So they sent him a bus ticket and he came up, but he was supposed to come up to Pontiac, Michigan.
Okay.
So I picked up Lightnin, and then we went to the bus station, no Lester. So I asked the guy behind the counter, I said, I'm looking for a guy. His name is Leslie Johnson. Was he on this trip? And a woman overheard me talking, and they said, well, there was a tall black guy that was sleeping on the bus. And in the meantime, the bus had already left. And I
Oh
said,
no.
so I asked the guy, I said, where is the next stop or the next big stop? And they said, Flint. And I already gone through Flint earlier that day because I was living in Saginaw at the time. So we drove back to Flint, and I told the guys in the car, I said, look, I gotta go I gotta go to the bathroom. So I went in the bathroom, and there was a tall black guy in there. And I said, are you lazy, Lester? He said, are you Fred? I said, yep. So that's how we
Wow.
met, actually, in the
So
bathroom at the bus station in Flint.
I wanted to ask you, the folk festival in Chicago, was that like the forerunner to the Chicago Blues Fest? Because
No, because
I know the
I
Blues
think
Fest
the
hasn't been around that
Chicago
long.
I think the Chicago Folk Festival, excuse me, is still going on.
Oh, okay. All right. All
They
right.
were different, but they were part of like well, the folk scene, and like uh, the guy who started Flying Fish record label, Bruce Eaglear, who was still working at Delmark,
Oh yeah.
Michael Franks from Earwig Records. They all had something to do with the festival. I'm not exactly sure what, but so we get there and they do their gig at the festival, and they had Paul, or not Paul, Paul Ashball, I think his name was, on guitar, second guitar or lead guitar, and Willie Warren on drums, or Billy Warren, who was playing with Buddy Guy and Junior Wells, and who just
Wow.
got back from a European trip with them. So everything was great. And so Lightnin and Lester played, and the set went fine. And we, I'm not going to go all, well, anyways, uh, it was a bad snowstorm that weekend. So we couldn't go back. We were stuck in Chicago for, well, as it turns out, a week.
Oh wow.
And we had a car problem as well. So on a Monday, because we were still there, Phil Guy called Lightnin, and he said, I want to pick you up and take you to Blue Monday at Teresa's, famous blues bar in
Sure.
Chicago. So we all I think Phil Guy had a Volkswagen at the time, a Bug, Volkswagen Bug, and him and his wife picked us up. So it was Lightnin, Phil Guy and his wife, and myself. I'm not sure where Lester went,
Oh,
but he wasn't with us. And so we went to Teresa's and Lightnin. I've got pictures of it in my blues book. Uh, Lightnin got to sit in with uh, Phil Guy and AC Reed, and I
man.
can't remember who the drummer was that was there, and another guy. But that night, not only was Lightnin Slim there, Hound Dog Taylor came in, sat in and played. Lefty Diz, a guy by the name of Howlin' um, uh, Howlin' Wolf Jr., I think, and a Muddy
Okay.
Waters Jr. I don't know who those guys were. And so it was a
Hangers
night of the
on.
blues. Right. And so then Phil said, well, we're going to go over to Pepper's. So we went over to Pepper's and we were there within 5 minutes. And I was the only white person in the bar. And a bottle flew by my head. And we were sitting in a circle seat, a horseshoe table like,
Hmm.
and a bottle flew right by my head. And Phil said, come on, we got to get, and they all were protecting me and got me out of there. And I didn't know what was going on, to tell you the truth.
Wow.
I was happy just being there. I thought it was an adventure. And so, anyways, and then nothing happened. And Phil took us back to where we were staying. And a few days later, or a week later, we drove back to Detroit because I had set up one more gig at the Chessmate Coffee House in Detroit.
Okay.
And that was a two-nighter. So I played drums on that, and I got my buddy Rick Stanky to play lead guitar. So we did that gig and for the two nights, and I can't remember. I remember doing it and everything, but I don't remember actually playing or anything. I mean, that was 54 years, now.
Sure.
But so then uh I went back to Pontiac, took them to Pontiac, and I drove back to Saginaw. And a few days go by, and I call up Lightnin and I said, "Could I speak with Lester?" And he goes, "Lester ain't here. He went back to Louisiana." I said, "Oh, really? No kidding." So that was the end of Lazy Lester for a bit until a few years later when he came back. But then I got Lightnin Slim some gigs in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And that was the posters in the other room. But that was with double billed with Dr. Ross, the harmonica boss. And that was the first time I got Lightnin in Ann Arbor. And that was, I think the club was being run by Peter Andrews at the time at the Canterbury House. And so it was also the first time Peter got Johnny Nicholas and Steve Nardella to back up Lightnin.
Wow.
So that's when I got to meet those guys for the first time. And Steve and I have been friends ever since, pretty much. But so we did that. Uh, oh, yeah. So we did that gig, and then we went to a party afterwards. And Dr. Ross, that was during his drinking days, and he got so drunk he was going, Muddy Waters, he ain't shit. I taught him everything. And we're all just going, oh my God, what's going on here? And he's out talking about Elvis Presley and Sam Phillips and so we were all just laughing pretty much at him, not at with him. And so then that was let's see, that was 71, 72. I got Lightnin Slim and supposedly Lazy Lester a tour in Europe.
Okay.
So I get back then, you used to get, of course, it was before emails, a telegram, and which I
Okay.
still saved. I think it's in my book. And from Jim Simpson in Birmingham, England, saying that he wanted to book Lightnin Slim, Lazy Lester for 5 weeks or whatever it was for this amount of money. And I said, okay, but I wrote him back and said, but I have no idea where Lazy Lester is because I was trying to get a hold of him again. And when I finally did get a hold of Lester, he told me he was into logging, working, cutting trees and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, so anyways, I got to go with Lightnin Slim to Europe with no harmonica player. But the first gig was a festival in Coventry, England. And that was the festival that Chuck Berry was on and did the live version of My Ding-a-Ling that's
Okay.
on the album.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And it was at that festival, Coventry. And Lightnin wanted to meet Chuck Berry. So I thought wouldn't be that big of a deal. So I went and knocked on his dressing room door, Chuck Berry's, and he finally came to the door. And I told him, and Lightnin Slim was right behind me. And I said, um, I forgot Mr. Berry, or, I can't remember exactly what I call. I said, Lightnin Slim wants to meet you. And he slammed the door.
Oh,
He
wow.
just slammed the door. And I thought, wow, how rude. So I've always had this attitude against Chuck Berry, not against his music, but because of slamming the door
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
Lightnin Slim.
Well,
And
I'd like to turn the page here, but I wanted to also say you're listening and watching Time Signatures. I'm your host, Jim Ervin. Along with us today is Fred Reif, who has obviously a lot to talk about and a lot to share. He also has two really cool books called Tell 'em About the Blues and All of Me, both of which we're going to talk about a little bit later on. We'll also let you know where you can get your own copy. But I wanted to ask you, when you were over in Europe in the early 70s, I had always heard that the blues didn't take off as much in the United States, mostly because of the race issues. But it was a lot more widely accepted over in Europe. Did that pretty much gel with what you saw?
most definitely, every night was jam packed. And also, there at the time that I went with Lightnin, the promoter had booked Eddie Burns, another Detroiter, for a 4 or 5 week tour. So Eddie and I became really good friends. And he asked me, he said, well, when we get back to Detroit, I want you to be my manager. And at the time, this was all, I was just starting all of this, so it was overwhelming. I said, yeah, okay, that sounds good to
And
me.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but I got to ask you, that was not your intention at the beginning of this, was it?
No, no, I was just,
You're just playing a rub board and having a good time with the band.
right. Yeah, so everything was happening, towards booking stuff. And so Eddie and I became really good friends. And Eddie told me one night at a local pub, he said, I just don't get it here, but I go to these gigs and everyone knows all my songs. And I
Wow.
can't even remember them all. So, and Lightnin said that to me too. One night in our room, we were back in our room, and he had on his, because it was so cold in the room, he had on his overcoat, and he was saying, Fred, I just don't understand it, man. How these people know my songs? And because someone that night requested some song that he had long forgotten, he said, and that because of that, he got it back in his memory, and the next night he would do it. And that went
Wow.
on and on. So by the end of the tour, he was doing some unbelievable old tunes because different people kept saying, can you do this? And I'm sure I didn't get to go to all of Eddie Burns's gigs,
Sure.
but I'm sure that was the same thing.
Well,
And both
Fred, I
Eddie,
wanted to ask you, with your touring and taking these guys to Europe and such, you had to have been rubbing elbows with some pretty big names in the blues. Did you ever catch yourself standing off to the side, watching these guys perform and kind of have a pinch me moment? I mean, did that ever strike you?
no, because that never happened. Um,
Okay.
one night while we were in London, though, the promoter took us to a club, a nightclub that supposedly, well, at that time, it was Wings, not the Beatles, Paul McCartney and Wings, and Eric Clapton, and all these different rock people that I had heard of would hang out at this club, supposedly.
Wow.
And, I don't know, maybe they were there. I don't know, but I didn't see any of them. So that was really the only. And then one night, Lightnin was booked for one of the opening acts for the Kinks, who didn't show up. And I was really looking forward to, because they were one of my favorite bands. And they
Sure.
also had did Lazy Lester's I'm a Lover, Not a Fighter early on. And so when they didn't show up, I just thought, oh man. But then another group that was on that gig was a group called Brewers Droop. And the lead singer, I think his name was Ron Watts, but who passed away a few years ago. But he also played accordion. And in that band, I read later, was the guy that was in the Police. Who's the guitar player? I can't think of
Uh,
his name.
I'm drawing a blank. I'm
I
sorry.
know.
I
But he
failed the
was
pop quiz.
supposedly, huh?
I failed the
He was
pop quiz.
supposedly the guitar player in that band. And I didn't
Okay.
know it until years later, but usually at the Lightnin Slim gigs, it was just Lightnin. And I don't remember. Well, at one of them, the only gig that I got to actually play the washboard on was at Leeds University, where the Who live at Leeds. And the day before we played, getting back to Paul McCartney, he was going around to different universities and asking if he could bring his new group called Wings to play, in the cafeteria or wherever.
Wow.
So, who was good? Paul McCartney was still huge. And, no one turned him down. So the next night, Lightnin played on the same stage, and most of the people there were still talking about, you can't believe who played here last night was Paul McCartney and Paul McCartney. And so when I got up, we had a jug band opened up for Lightnin, and who had a washboard. So I asked him if I could use his washboard and thimbles. And so I've got I got to play along with Lightnin's bass player, who I can't remember who he was now, and I played washboard. And
Wow.
that was at Leeds. So that was always been a story, mostly because of the Paul McCartney
Oh yeah.
episode.
Well,
I'm on
Fred,
the same stage, you know.
I want to turn the proverbial page, if you will. I want to talk about your books. You've got, and I've been flipping through and reading these since I got them from you a year ago. If you haven't seen a presentation by Fred about these books and about the stories that he's sharing this evening, we're going to talk about that a little bit later on and make that available so that if anybody wants to have Fred come and do a presentation, they can. But these two books are really incredible. A history of the musicians from Saginaw, Michigan, 1850s to 1950s. A book's called All of Me. And then the other book, this is the one that I was really having some fun looking at because the stories in there about the McRae brothers and a few others that I know. Tell them about the blues, interviews and stories by Fred Reif. Talk about these books a little bit. I mean, each of them individually stand on their own, but uh, obviously the interviews and stories had to be a labor of love for you. Yeah.
Definitely. And I guess all I have to do is continue the same story that I was just saying, talking about when I was in Europe with Lightnin Slim. Because when I came back, my friend John Gilmore, who I was in the jug band with, and who I got him to play harmonica on Lightnin Slim's first gig in Europe in
Wow.
Coventry, because he was there, but he came back earlier, and he got a job as the manager of a local chain called the Record Hut, a local record store chain. So when I
Okay.
came back, I got a job. As soon as I came back, he said, "Glad you're back. You're my new assistant manager." So in 1972, that started my whole career in the retail record business. And after John, or still when John was still there, but after he left, mostly when I was the manager, musicians were coming in, some old time musicians, like in that book from All of Me. And they had such great stories, and they were bringing me pictures, and I'm going, wow, wow. I was just so fascinated that this stuff has got to be preserved. I mean, come on, this is important. I mean, the song All of Me, which I had to come up with a name for the book, and that song is an American classic song
Sure.
co-written by Gerald Marks from Saginaw. And so, and I wasn't going back that far, but like on the cover of All of Me is a picture of Nelson Bitterman. So he came in my store one day and introduced himself and said, Oh, I've been a drummer since 1912.
Oh
And
my
I said,
goodness.
what? 1912? So the next time he says, oh, I'm going to bring, he lived in Garden City, Michigan, which is down by,
Yep.
closer to Detroit.
Hmm.
And he said, when I come back, I'm going to bring you a bunch of pictures because he was also the drummer in Gerald Marx's band, but also the photographer. So who wrote on the back the date, the time of the day, and who is on it?
Wow.
Perfect. I have about 100 of them. And but his drum kit. So I said, your drum kit. I said, I'm going to use that as the cover of my book. And I said, what year was that? And he goes, well, it was probably 1919 when my parents bought me this drum kit. And he goes, I know the next door neighbor must really be getting pissed when I was pounding on those things. And I'm looking at the drums and I'm going, wow, can't be too loud, I guess. I mean, there's not a whole lot there. And so he just fascinated me. And then he had pictures and posters of earlier than the Gerald Marx band and later. And so and then the guys who used to come in my store were more of the beboppers, from the bop time. And those guys were always, still are, if some of them are still alive. They all are real cool dudes, man. I mean, we talk the same language, put it that way.
Sure.
And except I know a former bass player who actually in one year, I think it was 1948, won Downbeat magazine best bass player. And
Wow.
that's when he moved back to Saginaw in 1949. And but he always used Jack Brusky is what I'm talking about. But he always, every time I'd see him, he'd say, groovy, man, groovy. And I thought, wow, I think that's from the hippie times, man. I don't know.
Yeah.
You know, groovy. Always, everything was groovy, man. Groovy. And but
Groovy and far out.
yeah, well, yeah, I still say that, but so then at the same time, I was working, I was working with Lightnin Slim because I got the job at the Record Hut in 1972, and I worked with him until 1974 when he passed away.
Wow.
And yeah, here's a story. I'll tell it here. I don't think I mentioned it in my book because it was I I I was I went to Lightnin's funeral, and of course, well, I went to the hospital, I should say, a week before he passed away, or a few days before he passed away, actually. And he was out of it, but he came and he saw me. He came out of his sleep or whatever he was in and said my name. And then when Boogie Woogie Red called me up a week later and said that Lightnin had passed, he told me, he said, because he was with me when I went to the hospital, and he said, I don't think Lightnin ever spoke again after he said your name.
Wow.
And so that always hit me. And then I went to the funeral and I got there early and there was no one there. and the casket was open. And I kept looking down at him and, just thinking of all the good times we had just not too long before that.
Yeah.
And so then, I don't mean to talk more about his funeral, but uh, at the wake, well, at the funeral also was Johnny Nicholas, who came. So we were actually the only two white people there, and actually the only two musicians that were there
Wow.
were Otis Hicks, which, a lot of people knew him by Otis, his real name. And at the wake, which turned out to be kind of a pretty drunken thing, all these girls were just all over Johnny and I, because we were working with Lightnin Slim, not Otis Hicks.
Sure, sure.
And so that was all new to me. I mean, I never had anything like that. So anyway, somewhere in there, Lightnin Slim had told me that Arthur Gunter, or the people from England, said I should find, they thought Arthur Gunter lived in Pontiac because he and Lightnin were on the same Excello label, even though Lightnin was more on the J. Miller part and Arthur was Ernie Young's part. And so I asked Lightnin, you ever heard of Arthur Gunter? And he goes, yeah, he used to live right down the street, but I heard he moved to Port Huron, Michigan. And I said, okay. So I came back to Saginaw and I went, I don't know, the next day I went to Hoyt, the head library, and they had a Port Huron phone book. So I just thought, well, here, I'll give it a try. So I looked up Arthur Gunter, and there he was. So I called him up and told him what I was about. And he goes, well, I don't know what you want with me. I don't know. But yeah, you can come by. So whenever I went by a week later, uh, he was he didn't really want to promote himself. He wanted to promote his older brother, Larry, who was also a guitar player. But they were too drunk and he couldn't. My impression of Larry, that he looked good, but he can't play the guitar. I mean, he just doesn't, he can't play it. It doesn't sound good. So I kept saying, Arthur, man, I can get you some gigs, man, in Europe, man. And he goes, no, 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 no. I don't fly anywhere. So I said, okay, all right. So I ended up getting him a gig at 73 Ann Arbor Blues and Jazz Fest. And he came and did his set. I have a picture of it in my book, a photo by John Rockwood, because I didn't have any live shots of Arthur. I just never at the time took any.
Right.
But so he did that gig, and then I got him a gig at the Blind Pig in Ann Arbor. So I was living in Saginaw. I went to Port Huron, picked him up, drove to Ann Arbor, and he only could do about 2 songs. And then on the way back, he was sitting in the back seat. My buddy was sitting in the front. And he said, open up the window, because I had, I don't know, push button. And all of a sudden I hear a bleh. And so that was one of the very last times I saw Arthur. And then he passed away not too long after that. But I didn't realize when he passed away. I mean, I wrote an article and an obituary and everything, but I didn't realize he was only 49 years old.
Wow,
49.
man.
And I just thought, to me, because at the time I was like 23 or something, 24.
Sure.
They were like old guys, old men. Boogie Woogie Red seemed like an old Lightnin Slim. When he passed, he was only 61.
Wow.
And I thought he was a real old guy.
Yeah.
But now I'm 77, so I'm wondering what somebody 24 thinks of me, I guess. Probably the same thing. But
Well, Fred, I want to talk to you about a couple of other things now. I know that you're involved, just kind of turning the page here. You're involved with a
uh,
group of guys up there in Essexville, who are part of a really cool podcast project. And I'd love to hear you talk about that because I know you're involved with this, and you've been with them for a few years, haven't you?
since the beginning, when I first moved up here in 2020 from Ann Arbor, Scott Baker gave me a call and finds out he just lived down the road a piece. And he said, ask me if I wanted. He goes, this is unbelievable. We got the guy here who has the Michigan Rock and Roll Legends website and the museum. And I want to start a podcast. And I said, he goes, would you be interested? And I said, yeah, I guess. What's a podcast? So we're talking 2020 now. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that's how far behind I am, I guess. But
Well, podcasts weren't
so
they weren't anything near what they are today, though. They've really come a long way over the since COVID. Yeah,
okay, all right.
yeah.
I still don't know that much about them. So, anyways, we had a meeting, I guess, and oh, I know another thing. I had put something on Facebook for my next book, and I decided I was going to write a chapter on polka music because polka music is so big here
Oh yeah.
in Bay City and Essexville and where I live.
You know, this is
And
my hometown, right? Bay City was my hometown.
oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I grew up in the South
Are
End.
you from the
What's that?
Are you from the South Side? Are
I
you
am.
Polish?
I am.
Oh,
Yeah, I little bit
well,
Polish. If you know where Roma's restaurant is, right there on
oh
Broadway
yeah,
by
yeah.
28th Street, that's right in my neighborhood.
My third
So
favorite
yeah.
restaurant. But but so I decided I put it on Facebook that told the story, about my next book. I decided I was going to add a chapter on polka music and Tejano music because Tejano is big in Saginaw. And I had never got so much response of information and photographs that I did on polka music. It was unbelievable. I could write a whole book on it, which maybe someday I will. But local polka.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
but so anyways, all this was happening when I was first moving here, and Scott Baker saw all of this and thought, yeah, this sounds good for a podcast. So I guess we had a meeting, and he told us his idea, and we thought, yeah, that sounds cool. And so we started inviting guests, and it seems like, well, the audience is getting bigger all the time, and we're now into our, I think Scott's the host and editor, and
Sure.
uh, and Gary Johnson and I are like the historians, and Mike Beatty is the videographer, or who takes pictures and all of that stuff. And because we're not like yours, it's just auto, or you can only see us or hear us.
Oh, okay. So it's
And
just audio. Gotcha.
right, audio. And we've had some interesting guests. And I usually go in, I hardly ever come in with notes, because most of the time, I was there or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I have my little story or something. I guess that's what he, you know, kind of wants. And but sometimes it's very educational to me. Like, I know basically my favorite group in the 60s, local group, was the Bossmen, of course. They were our Beatles,
Yep.
and a couple of other groups that I like. But other than that, when I got into the blues and jug band stuff, I was totally into that. So pretty much, except when I got in the record store business, then I got to know more, but not more in the local rock scene. So all of those are pretty educational to me,
Sure.
and I learned from that.
And it allows you to continue doing your interviewing and building, preserving stories and, basically what you do in your books right here is what we're doing in the podcast. In this podcast, I mean, we're preserving the history
Right.
of the blues and getting people like you to tell the stories. And that's one of the things that I have to say I understand where you're coming from. I really do. Fred, I wanted to ask you, I know that you're available to come out and do presentations, but talk about that just a little bit. What is the best way for people to get in touch with you to book you for a presentation and have you come out and talk about the history of blues in Michigan?
Well, I have at least for now, a web page, www.fredreif, FredReif.com.
Okay.
And my email is on there, but I could give you my email, FredInna@yahoo.com.
Okay,
And yeah,
great.
I love doing these lectures, especially when I did that one in Lansing, because a number of you people in the audience were at the things that I was talking about. So you could relate, it was almost like going to a black church and hearing amen,
Yeah.
call and response
Well,
type
and
of thing.
and the cool part is that was the early part of my podcast, and I knew I wanted to have you on. But I had different visions. I wasn't originally going to do video, and then it just kind of evolved that way. I had a good friend of mine who is mentoring me, and so I'm really glad that I waited to have you come on now, because I'm finding that I reach out to some of the people that I've interviewed previously on audio and asking them to come in and kind of do a second take,
Okay.
do a redo type thing. Um, Fred, this is your opportunity. Where can we get a copy of your books? Is that also available on your webpage? And by the way, we will have the links put up when this posts. We will make sure that it's up on Facebook and get it out there to help you
Oh,
sell some
cool.
more books. But go ahead and tell people where they can get your books.
Yeah, they can also get it through my website if you want an autograph copy. But also, I'm on Amazon Kindle,
Oh, nice. Okay.
And one of the reasons why I put it on there is because I had already, a couple of my European fans or people that I knew there who wanted to buy the book. The book costs $30 and the shipping at the time was $24.50.
Wow.
So probably now it's closer to 30. So I kept thinking, man, I got to figure out a different way. Maybe I could get a publisher in Europe or something. But then I read about Amazon. Somebody told me about Amazon Kindle, that they print and demand and in different countries. So
Nice.
that's, and I think most of the books that I've sold on Amazon Kindle are in Europe, local shipping, which is a lot better.
Yeah. Well, Fred Reif, I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day and your schedule for me, and sharing your history, you're sharing your stories, and we really appreciate having you here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Boy, I actually was just beginning to tell a story, but I guess, hey,
Well, we'll bring you back in. We
get a
can bring you
hold of
back
me
in.
for a lecture.
Yeah, we could. There you go. And we can also bring you back in for another segment. We've been at this for almost an hour already, if you can believe that.
I
I know
see
that
that. It
when you
just
did
went
when you
so
did your
quickly.
presentation, when you did your presentation in Lansing, it went by very quickly as well. But thank you again so much. Appreciate having you, and we'll definitely bring you back for another round. That brings this episode of Time Signatures to a close, but I can't end today without expressing to you, our loyal fans, followers, and listeners, my sincere thanks, because without you, none of this would be possible. This is Jim Ervin reminding you that keeping the blues alive is everyone's responsibility, but preserving the history of the blues one story at a time is my mission. Until next time, so long.
This has been Time Signatures with Jim Ervin, presented by the Capital Area Blues Society in Lansing, Michigan. For more information on cabs, visit capitalareablues.org. You can find this episode and past episodes at lccconnect.org. The Time Signatures theme song, Michigan Roads, is used by permission and was written by Root Doctor, featuring Freddie Cunningham.
You know I'm trying, baby, driving up and down these Michigan roads, yeah.
Until next time, keep on keeping the blues alive.